Ezra chapter 3, verse 1 through to 13, it says the following. When the 7th month came and the Israelites had settled in their towns, the people assembled as one man in Jerusalem. Then Jeshua, son of Jozadak, and his fellow priests, and Zerubbabel, the son of Shealtiel, and his associates began to build the altar of the God of Israel, to sacrifice burnt offerings on it, in accordance with what was written in the law of Moses, the man of God. Despite the fear of the people around them, they built the altar on its foundations and sacrificed burnt offerings on it to the Lord, both the morning and evening sacrifices. Then, in accordance with what was written, they celebrated the Feast of Tabernacles with the required number of burnt offerings prescribed for each day. After that, they presented the regular burnt offerings, the new moon sacrifices, and the sacrifices for all the appointed sacred feasts of the Lord, as well as those brought as freewill offerings to the Lord. On the first day of the 7th month, they began to offer burnt offerings to the Lord, though the foundation of the Lord's temple had not yet been laid. Then they gave money to the masons and carpenters, and gave food and drink and oil to the people of Sidon and Tyre, so that they would bring cedar logs by sea from Lebanon to Joppa, as authorized by Cyrus, king of Persia. In the 2nd month of the 2nd year after their arrival at the house of God in Jerusalem, Zerubbabel, son of Shealtiel, Jeshua, son of Jozadak, and the rest of their brothers, priests and Levites, and all who had returned from captivity to Jerusalem, began the work, appointing Levites 20 years of age and older to supervise the building of the house of the Lord. Jeshua and his sons and brothers, and Kadmiel and his sons, descendants of Hodaviah, and the sons of Henadad and their sons and brothers, all Levites, joined together in supervising those working on the house of God. When the builders laid the foundation of the temple of the Lord, the priests in their vestments and trumpets, and the Levites, the sons of Asaph, with cymbals, took their places to praise the Lord, as prescribed by David, king of Israel. With praise and thanksgiving they sang to the Lord, "He is good. His love endures to Israel forever." And all the people gave a great shout of praise to the Lord, because the foundation of the house of the Lord was laid. But many of the older priests and Levites and family heads who had seen the former temple wept aloud when they saw the foundation of this temple being laid, while many others shouted for joy. No one could distinguish the sound of the shouts of joy from the sound of weeping, because the people made so much noise, and the sound was heard far away. The journey from Babylon to Jerusalem is about 400 miles. They wouldn't have done it in a straight line, so they, from there straight across. They probably would have traveled northwesterly direction up the Euphrates River, and then kind of dropped down into Israel till they came down towards Jerusalem. 400 miles probably would have taken the 42,000 strong remnant probably about 4 months to travel the distance. 4 months. But that's just the travel time, right? Their journey to return to Israel and to return to Jerusalem would have lasted a lot longer. Probably approximately about 70 years. Their journey to return from Babylon to Jerusalem would have started on the day that Nebuchadnezzar came in with his army and totally destroyed Jerusalem, burning down the gates, burning the walls, breaking down the temple, just killing people in the streets and carrying off this remnant into captivity in Babylon. And there they waited for 70 years. And there would have been those amongst them that were saying, any day now we're going back, any day now we're going back, it's coming pretty soon. And so then Jeremiah, very famously in chapter 29 of his prophetic writings, you have the letter that's recorded, and Jeremiah says, look, don't listen to the false prophets. It's not coming tomorrow, it's not coming next week. You're going to be here for 70 years. And so their journey would have included the instruction that Jeremiah gives them, which I think is so instructive. Jeremiah says to them, listen, settle down, build houses, marry, have children. Pray for the prosperity of the city that you are in. And this is great logic, because if the city that you are in prospers, then you too will prosper. Hold fast to the promise. I'm not leaving you there. You haven't now gone into Babylon, you've entered a cul-de-sac, you're there in this kind of waiting period and that sort of thing, but I have a promise. I will bring you back after 70 years. I have a plan for you. And the people at that stage may be thinking, I wonder if God's finished with us. I wonder if God's had it with us. I wonder if God's had enough of us. And Jeremiah reminds them and says, no, listen, God's not finished with you. God has still got a plan with you. And you'll see the plan come to fulfillment if you seek God earnestly in prayer. If you seek him with all your heart in prayer, you will see this come to fruition. And all of these instructions forms part of their preparing to return, part of their journey to return. And then comes that moment, right? 70 long years of waiting to see for the moment to come when they can return. And then all of a sudden, Cyrus is now king of Persia. And his heart is moved by God, as it tells us in Ezra chapter 1. And he says, you can go back to your country. He had this policy where he allowed people that were in captivity to return and resettle in their countries that they had been taken from. And so he sends them back. But it's not just of his mind and making. Ezra chapter 1 tells us God moves his heart. Isaiah chapter 45 verse 1 very specifically points forward to the coming of Cyrus, who will be the one that will, release God's people to go back. And so Cyrus's heart has been moved, but at the same time there's the people of God, their hearts have been moved. And I have this theory. I don't know if I couldn't prove it from the text, but I have this theory that the people who returned, the 42,000 strong remnant, the one whose hearts were moved by God, I have this theory that they were the ones that took Jeremiah's letter to heart. They settled down and built houses and married. They prayed for the prosperity. They believed in the promise. They held fast to the fact that God had a plan for them. They were seeking God with all their heart, soul, mind, and strength. In other words, they were practicing the habits of discipleship, which positioned them to have their hearts moved by God to return. It would be easy to sort of think to ourselves that their time in captivity was a waste of time. But as I've been thinking about this story during the course of this week, I was just reminded, as we were reminded in the video a moment ago, God is always at work. God is always fulfilling his purposes. God is always at work bringing his plans to pass. But it's not just his plans that he's bringing to pass. He's also constantly at work in his people. Whatever our experience is, God was at work in the people of Israel while they were in captivity, and God will be at work in us if we allow him to be at work in us. Which kind of begs the question, really, doesn't it? When you look back over 2020 and 2021, will you be able to work out and see how God has been at work in your life, growing you? When you look back over 2020 and 2021, will you be able to say, I have grown? Or will you only be able to say, I have simply groaned? Will you have grown in grace? Will you have grown in the fruit of the Spirit? Love, patience, kindness, gentleness, self-control. Will you have grown in preferring others? Will you have grown in submission? Will you have grown in prayer and worship? Will you have grown in perseverance and faithfulness? Will you have grown, or will you look back and say, do you know what, I just groaned the whole way through? It'd be easy to think that the time of exile for the people of God was just a waste of time, but it's not true. Those that listened to Jeremiah's words, that took them to heart and put them into practice in their lives, those were the ones that probably would have grown. And so now they're in this position to be moved by God to return. And as they return back to Jerusalem, and as they begin to resettle and start up again in Jerusalem, we see certain things come to the surface that identify what was of first importance for them. As they emerge out of their own kind of lockdown to settle again in Jerusalem, their actions highlight for us what are the things that should be the priorities of God's people. And maybe, perhaps, it speaks into our own situation as we come out of lockdown. And so the remnant has returned. They arrive in Jerusalem. At the end of chapter 2, you read about this. And as they arrive, they give this free will offering, gold, silver, and priestly garments for the priests and that sort of thing. But then they disperse. Right? They're 42,000 strong. They can't all settle in Jerusalem. They need to go and find accommodation and that sort of thing. So this is the equivalent of arriving at a hotel and you just go and check your bags in the hotel, and then everybody meets in the lobby again afterwards, right? So they've just gone and they've checked their bags, finding a place to live. And then at the beginning of our text, where it picks up, they arrive as one man in Jerusalem. I love that. I love that simple little phrase, they arrive as one man. This is such a picture of unity. This is such a picture of fellowship. This is a picture of, hey, we're all committed to what it is that is going to happen here. And then you see, as you read through the rest of the chapter, you just see the priorities come to the surface. It starts with the restoration of the altar, which in a sense is the restoration of worship in Israel. The first thing that they do is they gather together as one man. The very first task that they have is to rebuild the altar, which in a sense is rebuilding or restoring worship in Israel. And it's significant. You know, we read through the text and we just we see, okay, they rebuilt the altar, and then we skip on to the next stuff that happens next. But the rebuilding of the altar is supremely significant because the altar is the place of sacrifice. The altar is the place where sacrifices are offered to make atonement for the sins of the people. And unless there is atonement for a sin, there is no restoration of worship. And when you look at if you've got a study Bible and that sort of thing, or if you've seen these pictures of the temple and tabernacle and what have you, you will notice how the furniture is placed strategically and symbolically in the temple and tabernacle area. And so the altar is literally just inside the entrance into the kind of tabernacle precinct and that sort of thing. But it's symbolically placed because it communicates to people, if they want to come and worship God, if they want to come and have fellowship with God, if they want to approach God, as soon as they come through the entrance, the very first thing that they've got to do is they've got to offer sacrifices, because there is no worship of God without the sacrifice and atonement of sin. The altar is significant because it's a place where they would offer thank offerings. You know, that free will offering that is written into the law, that if they just wanted to come and say thanks to God, they would bring this offering and they'd place it on the altar. And that would be their expression of saying to God, thank you, God, for everything that you have done. God, I praise you for who you are. Right? Remember Psalm 100? Enter his gates with thanksgiving and his courts with praise. And one of the ways they would have done that would be to offer these free will offerings on the altar, the offering of thanksgiving. The altar is significant because it's a place where fellowship offerings were placed. They would come and they would place their sacrifice as a fellowship offering, and then afterwards they would sit together and they'd share a meal as a family. And that sitting together, sharing a meal of a family, would be their horizontal relationship restored and enjoyed in that moment would be representative of their vertical relationship with God, restored, enjoyed in that moment. Israel knew first priority for us is the restoration of worship. They rebuilt the altar because the altar is the place where sin is atoned for, where fellowship is restored, where thank offerings were given. It's a sign of their dedication to God and their desire to be obedient. As they rebuilt the altar, it pointed towards the fact, hey, we're restoring worship in Israel of the one true God. It's interesting when you take this idea of the restoration of worship and you kick it into a New Testament context. It's interesting how everything moves in the opposite direction. You know, here you see the worshippers coming from Babylon to Jerusalem. They set about making these offerings, and they set about building the altar so that they can restore worship of God and relationship with God. But in the New Testament, what happens? It's all moving the other way, right? We're dead and lost in our sin and transgression, and God, because of his great love and mercy, he sends his one and only Son, Jesus, to us. The movement is from God towards sinful humankind. And then Jesus comes and he lives the perfect life on our behalf, and he offers that perfect life as a sacrifice for sin on the altar, which is the cross. And in that moment, as I've said so often before, the doors are thrown wide open. So that whoever believes in Jesus and his life-giving sacrifice on the cross can be forgiven of their sin, can be reconciled to God, can be born again of the Spirit and adopted into God's family. Will acknowledge and honor Jesus from that moment on as Lord of their lives, the ones that directs their footsteps. Because remember, there is no Christian discipleship without the Lordship of Jesus. It's God moving towards us. It's God coming towards us. God saying, I want to know you. I want you to know me. The restoration of worship in a New Testament context comes with Jesus atoning for sin so that a way is open that we might approach the throne of grace and find help and find mercy. You know, it's impossible to miss the priority of worship for these people, which kind of begs the question, really. You know, as they, on their own roadmap out of Babylon, they show us that the first thing that's the most important is the restoration of corporate worship, the corporate gathering and worship of God's people. You know, as you've thought through the dates, the 8th of March, the 12th of April, the 17th of May, the 21st of June, or maybe it's going to be 4 weeks later, who knows? And you've thought about shops opening and restaurants opening and pub gardens opening, and I can hug my grandkids, and I can get together with 6 people in the house, and 30 people outside, and all of this sort of thing. And all of these things are wonderful, and they're all good. But in the midst of all of that, where does the gathering, corporate gathering of God's people together for worship, where does that fit? The Israelites would have said, it's going right to the top. That is the most important thing for us right now. God's bringing us back, so we're putting that right up at the top. That's the most important thing for us. And then flowing out of that, priority number 2, flowing just straight out of that, following the restoration of worship, follows obedience to God. Seeking to follow his ways, seeking to learn from him, seeking to be apprenticed to the law of Moses. In other words, the restoration of wholeheartedly following God. To bring in some New Testament language, we could say the restoration of discipleship. It's captured in the words in the text that I've read this morning. Then in accordance with what was written. So what are they doing here? They're asking themselves this question. They're saying, okay, so worship has been restored. Now we can offer the burnt offerings and that sort of thing. But now the question for us is, now that we've returned and we're living here, how do we live consistently in obedience to God? How do we live as God's people? What is it that God requires of us? What do we know about God, and what is it that God requires of us? These are discipleship questions, right? These are questions that we've been asking ourselves all the way through this year as we've looked at the series that we've been looking at in discipleship. Who is God? What does he require of us? What does it mean to follow Jesus? And so they do what we've been doing throughout this year. We go back to Scripture and we find out about who God is in Scripture and what he requires of us in Scripture. And they would have done the same thing looking at the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible. And they would have come across in Leviticus the Feast of Tabernacles. And they would say, oh, hold on a second, it's the 7th month. Which means if we're going to live in obedience, then we need to be celebrating the Feast of Tabernacles. And again, this is just like rich with significance. Because the Feast of Tabernacles, it just seems like it pops up at all these crucial moments in Scripture. The dedication of Solomon's temple was at the dedication of the Feast of Tabernacles. Nehemiah chapter 8, the revival when Ezra preaches, it was the Feast of Tabernacles. Jesus, when he stands up at the temple in John chapter 6 and says, if anyone is thirsty, let him come to me and drink, and streams of living water will flow from within him. That was the Feast of Tabernacles. It just keeps coming up at these key moments all the time. And I think it does because it's a particularly important feast. At the heart of this feast was remembrance. Came 5 days after the Day of Atonement, the day when the gathered community of God would gather and they would observe what we read about in Leviticus 16. They would bring their sacrifices to make atonement for the whole community of God's people, for the sins that they were conscious of and the ones that they weren't even conscious of. And the whole community would be cleansed. And then the harvest would be brought in. So the harvest of the threshing floors are full of God's bountiful provision for them. And then they do this curious thing, which would be great for those of you that love camping, right? They moved out of their houses into booths. So they'd take branches from the trees and they'd lay them over sticks and stuff and create these little shelters that they would live in. Now just think for a moment. If you had to move out of your home into one of those this afternoon, most of you are thinking, please remember to take the sun cream, got to take the sun cream, got to take the sun cream, and a hat, and a hat. How would that disrupt your life? How would that turn upside down your routine? How much extra space would you have just to sit and to be and to reflect and to remember? So now not only are they living in these temporary dwellings like the exiles would have lived in as they traveled from Egypt towards the promised land, but now they're thinking about the journey, about how God has brought Israel out of captivity in Egypt towards the promised land. And now they're thinking about how God has brought them from Babylon towards Jerusalem. And then they're thinking about the gracious provision of God as the Israelites left Egypt. And remember, the people gave them silver and gold, and then God's provision of manna and quail and water. And now they're thinking about their own journey out of Babylon, and God had moved people's hearts to give them silver and gold. And Cyrus has given them all the temple artifacts of gold and silver that were to be used for worship in the temple. And then they're thinking about judgment and the impact of sin and not walking obediently with God. And then they're thinking about the patience of God and the kindness of God and the mercy of God. And all the while, they're remembering who God is, and they're remembering what God has done. Remembering that He alone is Lord and He alone is God and there is no other. Remembering His gracious mercy towards them as well as His discipline. Remembering His faithfulness and promise. And then afterwards, in joyful response to that, just committing themselves to follow Him. Committing themselves to walk with Him and to fellowship with Him. And again, is that not what is at the heart of discipleship? And if we think back to the beginning of this year when we looked at the foundations of discipleship, is it not a remembering that Jesus is Lord? And an acknowledgement that Jesus is Lord? And is the kind of grounding place and the rooting place, is that not the gospel, where we encounter both the truth of God that exposes our sinfulness, but also the grace of God that rescues us from our sinfulness? And then this kind of joyful commitment to say, I will follow Jesus. I will pick up my cross daily and I will follow Him. And please don't miss the flow of things here, right? The restoration of worship leads to the restoration of discipleship. It doesn't move in the opposite direction. Restoration of worship leads to the restoration of discipleship. If you try come at it from the other side, a restoration of discipleship first, before worship, you will end up with a kind of legalistic way of following the Lord. It's worship that captivates our hearts. It's worship that strengthens our hearts. It's worship that just melts our hearts. That then leads to the obedience that we encounter in discipleship. I remember my mom sending me a text or message on the evening that I was baptized here. We still had a stage up at the front here. The baptistry was in the front here. And she sent me a text, and the verse was from John's Gospel where Jesus says, if you love me, you will obey my commands. Not obey my commands to prove that you love me. Actually, no. If you love me, if your heart has been beggared by grace, if your heart has been touched by grace, if your heart has been melted by grace, and that which you encounter in worship, just beholding the glory and the majesty and the power and the perfection and the purity of God, and just the wonder that we get to come into His presence. And we get to come to worship Him. And that does something to us, which leads to, do you know what? Because of all God has done for me, I will seek to walk in obedience with Him. The flow is important. And so there's the restoration of worship, and then the restoration of discipleship. And just automatically, I think, happening is the restoration of their witness. I may be stretching this a bit, but because there's no explicit mention of witness in this chapter. But if you look at the last line in chapter 13, it says, and their sound was heard far away. The sound was heard far away. What's just happened? With the worship of God restored, with discipleship discipleship now being restored. They're listening to what God has said to them through the scriptures. They're putting that into practice in their life. Now they get about the task. Now they get about the task of doing what they were sent back to Jerusalem to do in the first place, which is to rebuild the temple. And again, it's just this beautiful picture of everybody coming together. This isn't just a few doing the work. All of them are coming together. Some of them are bringing tithes and offerings, and there's gold and silver and oil and stuff that they're using to buy wood from Tyre and Sidon, which comes down by sea to Joppa. And so they're getting all the equipment together. But then you've got the families are coming together with brothers and sons, and they're kind of doing what they need to do. And some of them are supervising the building, but it's just this picture of the whole community of God's people coming together with this around this common task of rebuilding the temple. And they finished the foundation. Not finished the whole task, they finished the foundation. And they're like, stop. We need to praise. We need to celebrate. We need to have a party of praise just to recognize what God has done here. And so again, they don't just rush into it. They get what David has said. What has David prescribed for worship? And so they get all this information together. Okay, so that's how we need to do it. We're going to do this properly, all right? And they all get together, and they've got the cymbals and the music instruments are out and that sort of thing, and then they begin to sing that great song which seems to thread its way all the way through the Old Testament. He is good, and his love endures to Israel forever. The key word for us there is forever. Through judgment and discipline, God's love endures forever. Through captivity and lockdown, his love endures forever. Through your fumblings and your failings and your finiteness, his love endures forever. That's a good news word right there, right? Through everything that we encounter in life, his love endures forever. And then there's this, as they sing this song and the instruments are playing, there's this noise that goes up. And everybody hears. And what is it that they hear? The Lord is God. The Lord is King. And his people are back in Jerusalem, and they've restored worship, and they're restoring discipleship, and it's leading to a profound witness. I can tell you, it's not, again, not in the text, but I can tell you, as people heard that noise, what would be the question that they would ask? What on earth is going on? And the people would have said, hey, this is what's going on. 3 simple priorities for God's people as they return out of lockdown in Babylon. The restoration of worship, the restoration of discipleship, and the restoration of the witness to the surrounding people. And it would be wonderful at this point to say that it was all easy. I wish I could point you to the end of the book of Ezra and say, there's this great line at the end there where it says, and they lived happily ever after. But you know that's not going to happen, right? You know that's not the way life works. And so in the text and out of the text, we see that actually there's challenges. There's difficulty. There's things that need to be overcome. They've got challenges from without, and they've also got challenges from within. It reminds us that whenever the people of God move forward, there will always be a certain amount of challenge to overcome. There will always be a certain amount of conflict. There will always be a certain amount of that rubbing. The nature of moving forward means that there is that kind of friction, and they experience it, first of all, from without. So in chapter 3, as they're rebuilding the altar, there's this kind of throwaway line that they were fearful of the people around them. And if you jump into chapter 4, you find out that there's good reason why they're fearful. Because there's people who are the enemies of Judah and Benjamin who don't want the restoration of the worship of God restored. They don't want to see people growing in obedient following of the Lord. And so they come initially and they say to them, hey, listen, can we join in the work? They don't really want to join in the work. They just want to frustrate the plans, right? And wisely, Jeshua and Zerubbabel say to them, actually, no, you have no part with us. And so the next step, do you know what they do next? They go and hire some conspirators, thugs, who then come and watch the people building. And do you know what they do? They don't throw stones at them. They don't physically manhandle them or anything. They just stand there and day and night they discourage them. This faith-filled people who have been shouting with praise to God, having everything restored, but they've got this constant nagging discouragement that just goes on and on and on and on. And do you know what happens? It just eventually becomes overwhelming and they stop for 5 years. Discouragement is not one of the gifts of the Spirit. And it is impossible for even the most faith-filled, strong of heart, stout of heart believer and follower of Jesus to flourish under discouragement. If you live your life under a constant umbrella of discouragement, eventually it is going to knock the strength out of you. It does to the people here, seeing God's hand at work so powerfully in their lives. You think to yourself, they should have been able to push through. That's the power of discouragement, friends. And that's just the stuff from outside. But inside, there's issues that they're facing inside as well. It's captured in the celebration. There's this, as they see the laying of the foundations and it's all finished, and there's this group of young people that are just like, this is amazing. This is just absolutely amazing. We had heard that God could move. We had believed this. And now we see it. The foundations are laid, and this is just the most incredible thing. But then there's the older, those that are the priests and that sort of thing, the heads of families that remember what the old temple looked like. And they're weeping and they're wailing. And I get it. I get it. I totally understand it, because it's not what they remember. And they came back with a sense of hope. It's going to be restored to like it was before. And it doesn't look like that. But we need to be aware of that. Because that too, like discouragement, can just draw strength out. Haggai and Zechariah, the prophets, you can read their books separately, they're both going to say into this context and this situation, hey, don't despise the day of the beginning of small things. One commentator remarks on this, and he says, the backward look which discounts present activity is always a peril. Regrets over the past which paralyze work in the present are always wrong. Moreover, all such regrets, as in this case, are in danger of blinding the eyes to the true value and significance of the present. And these things just remind us that God will bring about the restoration of these things in and through us. But as we go through this, there's always going to be challenges to overcome. Stuff that we need to work through. And all the while, God is at work. And that's it. 3 priorities that just come to the surface as God's people come out of exile in Babylon. The restoration of worship, restoration of discipleship, and flowing out of that, the spontaneous restoration of their witness to the communities around that. Now I wonder, as we just draw this to a close, I wonder what lessons, if you think back on this chapter now, and your own experience of lockdown and coming out of lockdown, I wonder where these things fit. Where is the restoration of corporate worship on your list of priorities? Of fellowship with God's people? How are you growing as a disciple? We've looked at the habits. Have you got a plan? Are you accountable to somebody? Are you being consistent in what you're doing? Are you initiating, so you've made a start? Are you trusting God to be at work in the midst of all of that? And then in what ways are you praying and anticipating that as you worship God wholeheartedly with your life and follow Him wholeheartedly as a disciple picking up your cross, in what ways are you expecting, anticipating to see God use you to be a light to those who don't know Him? Through the godliness of your life, the message that you speak, through the integrity of your work. In what ways is people going to see God at work within you? I think those are good questions to reflect on. Good questions to take to heart.